I know a lot of you. I'm the Director of Accountability, and I'm going to be talking to you about a couple things today, the first being the accountability system. But I do want to just take a few minutes to echo what Joanne just said, and I've said this to a few of you already, but I really like being invited to this conference because this is the group that really gets it done. And so it's really nice to come out here from the WDE, spread information to you guys, and know that you'll go back and you'll share it with your districts, that you will push back when you have questions. That's very, very much appreciated because it helps us improve our work. And I've just really been grateful for the relationship that we've had with the Curriculum Directors Association. So thank you for having us again this year. So we'll just go ahead and jump right into the next slide. How many of you are familiar with accountability in Wyoming? Oh, that's good. Okay. So we do have three separate models that work together in one system. We have the traditional model that was written into law in 2011, I think, the Wyoming Accountability and Education Act, or WAEA for short. And I'll explain that model a little bit in a little bit more detail in the next slide. We have a state model for alternative schools as well under WAEA, and that came about in 2015 when the state legislature directed the department to convene a group of educators from around the state to develop a model that helped meaningfully differentiate the performance of alternative schools against other alternative schools, as opposed to comparing alternative schools to traditional schools. And I do want to let you know that the model for the alternative school accountability has been nationally recognized. Sean is my colleague over there, we have been asked to present to the American Youth Policy Forum, which is a national organization, about the model. We've gotten a lot of questions nationwide about how we do things in Wyoming. And one of the things that sets us apart, I think, from the rest of the country is that we do have the support of our legislature, who directed us to do this, who has supported us every time we've had to go and report to them on our progress and things like that. That is something that other states don't have, so we're pretty lucky that way. And then we have the federal model for all schools, and that is the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, which was signed into law, I don't know, 2016, 2017, somewhere around there, but we had our plan, our state plan, approved in 2018. We did have to revise our plan to update it using our current assessment data, and that was approved as well. So we are working under an approved state plan for accountability for ESSA. So if you'll go to the next slide. So even though we have three different models, we do have one accountability system, and you can see here, these are all of the indicators that fall under both WAEA and ESSA. So we have achievement, which is based on YTOP performance. If you are not aware, last year was the first year that ACT was not calculated into the achievement indicator, only YTOP. Growth has always been part of the model. Equity has always been part of the model. English language proficiency is new because ESSA requires it, and the state legislature wanted to make sure that we aligned our system as much as possible, or the state model with the federal models as much as possible. So the state legislature adopted this as an indicator under WAEA as well. The graduation rate has always been part of accountability. Post-secondary readiness is new. The feds required us to have what's called a fifth indicator, or a non-academic indicator. And so post-secondary readiness is what we have, which is based on the percentage of students who participate in either college, career, or military-ready activities when they're in high school. So because ESSA required us to do that, WAEA aligned the same way at the direction of the legislature. We do have two additional indicators under WAEA that are not part of ESSA. One is credit earning. For traditional high schools, as most of you know, we calculate the number of credits that students earn by the end of their freshman year, and they need to earn a quarter of the credits that are needed to graduate on time. In alternative schools, we actually collect that data from 9th, 10th, and 11th grade. And then climate is another indicator, and that is specific to the alternative model that is done through a 24-question climate survey that actually just closed last week in all of the alternative schools, and we use that data for the alternative school score model. We click on this link right here. So So, and this is in your folder, all of our presentations, so all the links that are here are in your folders. Well, that is really tiny and hard to see, but that's a comparison table, and I do want to take just a few minutes to explain how this is laid out. And some of you may have already seen this before. I've presented on this quite a few times, but what this shows you is how things function in Wyoming for our state model versus our federal model. It also explains how the indicators function for 3 through 8 schools versus traditional high schools versus alternative schools. And anywhere that you see red is where there's a difference between how it functions in one place versus another. So again, there is a link to this in the presentation, and you can print it out if you'd like to, study that, frame it, whatever it is you'd like to do with it. But it's just a really nice, I think it's nice because I'm the one who created it, but it's just a nice way to kind of lay out how things are different, because one of the things we heard a lot was, how are the schools going to operate with 2 different models and 2 different sets of expectations? And so this is just showing you how it actually looks in real life. And at the top of each indicator is an indicator description, although I know a lot of us are familiar with what each of those are, and then how they function in each of the models. So I just wanted to take a minute to point that out. All right. Next slide. Nope, sorry. Keep going. Go back this way, this way, this way. Right there. So in the WAEA model, each indicator receives, a score or determination based on performance. And so under WAEA, on an indicator, a school can be below target, meeting target, or above target. And then in ESSA, they are either below average, average, or above average on each target. And then all of those indicators and the markings on those indicators, or the scores on those indicators, are then rolled up into an overall school performance level. And for WAEA, you can be exceeding expectations, meeting, partially meeting, or not meeting expectations. But under ESSA, you are either identified or you're not. And if you're identified, you can be identified as either needing comprehensive support and improvement, which are state-led supports, or you could be identified for targeted support and improvement, which is based on subgroup performance, and those are district-led supports, or you can be identified for additional targeted support and improvement. And those start out as being district-led supports, but after 4 years, if there's an improvement, and again, this is also what am I trying to say, subgroup indicator. So TSI and ATSI is based on the subgroups performance, not the all students performance. After 4 years of being an ATSI, if a school does not improve, then they're identified as CSI, and then they participate in state-led sports. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but those are just the differences in how things, how schools are identified. And how many of you are familiar with the implementation handbook that we publish every year? Really technical. It talks about how the model, I see some of you nodding your head. It's very complex, but it makes it very easy to understand. And so a lot of times during the review window every year, we get a lot of phone calls, and districts want to know, well, how did you calculate achievement? How do you know I'm below target on achievement, or that I'm meeting target on growth? Or how do you calculate targets versus the way you calculate averages under ESSA? So there is a link on your school performance reports to the implementation handbook that explains in great detail how to do that. Although you can always call me, because it's easier just to get an answer from me than to have to read the whole manual. But if you want to know if I'm telling you correctly, you might want to double check what I say with what the manual says, because that was written by someone much smarter than I. So on the next slide, nope. That's okay. So these are just some highlights from the last accountability cycle. These are all links that I'm not going to click on right now, but this takes you to the report that we have to submit to the Legislative Services Office every year about what's going on with the model and how every single school is performing for WAEA. This link here We'll take you to a presentation that we give to the JEIC almost every year. They almost ask for it every year. So in November of 2018, we gave them a very technical analysis of the model and how schools performed during the 2017-18 school year. And this here will take you to the state report card. Have any of you had an opportunity to look at the state report card and kind of play around with that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty neat. And so you can look at that at the state level, the district level, and the school level. But a few things I do want to point out. Just over 55% of the traditional schools were meeting or exceeding expectations, and about 63% of the alternative schools were doing the same, meeting or exceeding alternative school expectations. Now for alternative schools, 2017-18 was the last of a 2-year pilot run that the legislature directed us to do for the alternative school accountability model. And so this was, for alternative schools, informational only, but a lot of alternative schools chose to share their school performance level reports with their community, with their local school board, so that they can see, how that model's working out for them. And so far, it seems to be working pretty well. For ESSA, we had just 21 schools identified for comprehensive support and improvement. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about how do schools get there and what happens when they do get there. We had 34 schools that were identified for one or more subgroups, so for targeted support and improvement. And then we had 2 schools that were identified for one or more subgroups for additional targeted support. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So this highlights the cohesiveness of the system. So as I said at the beginning, we have 3 models, but we have 1 system. So 44% of the schools earned the same school performance rating last year that they did the year before, even though in 2016-17 we were giving the pause, and in 2017-18 we were giving Y-top, and in 2016-17 we used ACT for achievement, and in 2017-18 we did not. And also in 2017-18 we added indicators that were not part of the model before. And so even with those changes, the model, the system stayed pretty steady. 55.8% of schools in 16-17 were meeting or exceeding expectations. And a few slides back, it was just over 55%. I think it was like 55.4% of all schools were meeting or exceeding expectations in 17-18. So again, very similar. And then this right here, I think, is the most important bullet on the page. There weren't any traditional schools that received a meeting or exceeding expectations school performance level rating that were then identified for comprehensive support and improvement, or ATSI. So that would indicate that there's a really big problem with the model, because how can you be an exceeding expectations school but identified for comprehensive support and improvement? If you're identified for comprehensive support and improvement, that means you're among the bottom 5% of all schools. So that would point us to believe that there's something wrong with the model, and that did not happen. We did have 2 that were identified for a couple of subgroups for TSI, but overall, very cohesive. So on the next page, schools are identified for support, and they're identified for different reasons under different models. So if you are a WAEA partially meeting or not meeting expectations school, depending on, and I know Shelley Andrews is here and is going to talk much more about this, but depending on how many years you've been identified as partially meeting or not meeting, you may be identified for different levels of support. Now, the statute says that schools have to submit school improvement plans no matter how many years you've been there. But the degrees of support under WAEA vary depending on how many years you've been at that school performance rating. For ESSA, you have the designation, again, like I said, you're either identified or you're not. And you can either be identified for CSI, TSI, or ATSI. So if you're identified, what does that mean? Go to the next slide. So it means that you have to submit a school improvement plan. And you, in that plan, address the specific indicators that are leading to